Hello, and welcome to the 10-Minute Counselor. I heard a preacher say one time that there is no word that he lives closer to than the word trouble. And when I first heard him say that, I thought, what a bizarre statement. But then I started thinking about my own life. I don't think there's any word that I have lived closer to than the word trouble. As sparks fly upward, Job says, so do the troubles of man. And we will have suffering in this life. So it is absolutely imperative that we have a strategy for our suffering. Again, this is only 10 minutes in counseling, but I will tell you, in the next 9 minutes, we're going to give you a strategy for suffering that can change your life and help other people. In James chapter 1 and verse number 12, it says this, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, trials, affliction, suffering, heartache. For when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him." In the book of 1 Peter, it talks about that the trying of our faith is more precious than gold. Well, that's only true if you have a strategy for your suffering. So, when you come to suffering, what do? Number one, find out the purpose of the suffering. Oh, Jim, I don't think we should question God about the things that happen to us. Whoa. We may not understand everything, but it is absolutely a right, godly, and wise thing to do to ask the Lord, Lord, why am I going through this suffering? I'm not to question the curriculum. I'm not to question the suffering and the fire that he's chosen. But I definitely can ask him why I'm going through this. Now, I believe there's 3 reasons why a person goes through suffering. Number 1 is our own sin. Would you agree? Hebrews chapter 12 makes it very clear that the chastening of the Lord proves that he is our heavenly Father, and that whoever he loves, he chastens. Now listen, none of us have arrived. Every one of us, we're deceiving our own selves if we don't think that we have sin in our life. The very first thing we ought to do is find out the purpose for our suffering, and the very first purpose we ought to evaluate is this: Lord, is there anything in my life that is not right? Search me, O God, and try me. See if there be any wicked way in me. Psalm 139 talks about. So we find out that maybe the purpose is that there's sin in our life, and the Lord wants to produce the peaceable fruit of righteousness in our life. So we're going through suffering so we get the sin out of our life. Number 2, it can be for service. There is a really great verse. Sometimes I say the word cool. There is a really cool verse in Philippians 1:29. I want to read it to you. Philippians 1 and verse 29. "For unto you it is given in the behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake." Now notice the key word in that verse is given, as a gift. In other words, God allows some people to suffer as a gift given to them so that they can serve the Lord. You say, Brother Schuttler, I don't understand that at all. Oh, one of the greatest gifts that God gives some of his choice servants is to go through suffering to be able to for what it's going to do in their own life. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But what it can do in others people's life. Hey, let me just ask you something. Have you ever visited somebody that was going through suffering with the purpose to encourage them, only to leave and you got more blessed and more encouraged than what you gave to them? Oh, that's happened to me many times. I have visited many a church member that after I left, I said, Lord, I went to encourage them and be a blessing to them, but their life and their spirit and their attitude through this suffering was more of a blessing to me. Number 3 is strength. One of the reasons why we go through suffering is to get stronger. And that's stronger spiritually, not physically. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, we're familiar with the passage. Paul goes to the Lord. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that he might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. God puts us through suffering, through the thorns of the flesh, to make us stronger in the grace of God and him. And then look at what Paul says in verse 10. Therefore I take pleasure, 2 Corinthians 12:10. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distress, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. Okay, so I believe that there's three purposes for suffering in your life. You ought to find out what it is. Is it sin in your life? Is it for service for the King? Or is it to build strength in the Lord? Now, I think sometimes there's a fourth, and it's stupidity. Sometimes we suffer for our own stupidity. That's probably closely to the sin. But if I had to put a fourth S, I would say sometimes it's our own stupidity why we're suffering. So find out the purpose. Number two, determine the attitude. And I think that's the James 1:2. My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations. Okay, so what's the strategy for my suffering? Number one, find out the purpose of it. Number two, determine your attitude through it. You know what, Lord? I'm going to count it all joy. You make that decision. You cannot determine the circumstances. You cannot determine a lot of things in your life, but there is one thing you can always determine. That is your attitude that you're going to have through the suffering. Number one, find out the purpose. Number two, determine the attitude, James 1:2, but count it all joy when you fall into many different kinds of trials, sufferings, and temptations. Number three, endure because of the reward. And that's the James 1:12. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life. Listen, there is a reward. It is worth it. There is the glory that we will receive is far greater than the suffering of this present time, Romans chapter 8 says. You get through it because of the reward at the end of it, the reward of becoming more like Christ, the reward of the grace that you're given, and the reward of the crown of life that you get in heaven. You know what? You just suck it up, you get some grit, you get back up, and you keep going because of the reward, not the temporal reward, not the immediate reward, but the eternal reward that you're going to get through this suffering. So you endure because of the suffering. You determine the attitude, you find out the purpose, and then number four, and we're done, and this is so good, you minister to others. I think this is critical to understand. And the perfect illustration of this is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. And in 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 5, Paul writes, and he's talking about the churches of Macedonia. And it says, the great trial of affliction that those churches are going through, the great suffering that they're going through. And while the churches of Macedonia were going through great persecution, great suffering, great affliction, what did they do? They ministered to others. They gave of their liberality, and first of all, they gave their lives. Now, you got to get this. I think this is the key to strategy for suffering. Get your eyes off of your hurt and get your eyes on the healer and begin to decide, I am going to minister to other people while I'm suffering. Oh no, Jim, the key is people are supposed to minister to me while I'm suffering. The churches at Macedonia did not do that. While they were going through a great trial of affliction, they actually ministered to many other people. What a testimony. And when you get your eyes off of your own suffering and you begin to even use your suffering and trial to minister to others, my friend, you have a strategy for victory. And you're going to see your suffering be incredible, not only for others, but in your walk with the Lord. Paul says it all in Philippians 3:10, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death. We get to know the Lord through suffering like no other time. We take that suffering and we have a strategy for it. When we go through that trial, that heartache, that affliction, that adversity, that suffering in our life, Lord, why am I going through this? Do I have sin in my life? Is this to serve you? Lord, is this to strengthen my walk with you? Is it because of stupidity in my life? Lord, I determine I'm going to have the right attitude through this suffering. I am going to have joy through this suffering. Lord, I'm going to endure. I'm not going to quit because I want to see the reward of the crown of life for me getting through this. And Lord, I'm going to take the suffering and I'm going to use it to minister to others. While I am suffering, I'm going to be an encouragement and a help to others. That, my friends, is a success strategy for suffering.